Bidders laughed at the crippled girl. A quiet rancher placed $75 and left. The auctioneer had a voice like a broken hinge, kept squeaking up at the end of every sentence, trying to make it sound like opportunity. There were 9 of us in the yard behind Garner's feed store, counting the girl on the block and the man running it, and maybe 4 of the 7 who were left would have qualified as bidders in any honest sense of the word. I was there for a mule. That was the full extent of my intention when I rode into Callow Creek that Tuesday in October. The Breckett brothers were selling off their father's stock, and I'd heard there was a good-boned gray that might do for the north pasture. I'd come in early, tied hatched to the rail outside the feed store, and was looking over a hand-painted notice on the board when I heard the auctioneer start up. I didn't even turn around at first. Auctions in those years covered everything: tools, furniture, debts worked off in labor. I'd seen men auction their own harness. Then somebody laughed. It was that particular kind of laugh, the kind that comes up from the belly when a man sees something he thinks he has the right to find funny. I turned around. She was standing on a wooden crate so the small crowd could see her. Maybe 20 years old, maybe less. Brown hair pinned up rough, dress that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of old cream. She was holding a flour sack that had everything she owned in it. I found out later, and she was looking at a fixed point somewhere above and behind the auctioneer's left shoulder. Like she'd decided the middle distance was the only place worth looking. Her left leg was shorter than her right. You could see it even with her standing still, the tilt of her hip, the way her weight sat. Some kind of childhood thing, the way it looked. She'd learned to carry herself so it wasn't the first thing you noticed, but on a crate in front of 7 men it became the first thing anyway. The man who'd laughed was Denny Falk. He ran the slaughterhouse on the south edge of town and had 3 fingers missing on his right hand from a machine he'd built wrong. He said something to the man beside him, and that man laughed too, quieter, like he was borrowing it. The auctioneer said the girl, her name was Clara Voss, had come west as a domestic worker for a family named Phelps. The Phelpses had hit bad luck, which was a polite way of saying Mr. Phelps had drunk himself through 2 years of wages and then into the ground, and Mrs. Phelps had taken her children back to her sister in Ohio and left some debts behind. Clara Voss was one of the items in the debt settlement. 14 months of back wages the estate couldn't cover, and a contract that said she'd signed on for 3 years' service, and there were 16 months still owed. Not to her, to anyone who bought the contract. I want to be plain about what I was feeling standing there. It wasn't exactly anger. Anger is hot, and I was something colder than that, that feeling you get when you see a thing done wrong, and the wrongness of it is so ordinary that no one around you can even see it. The laughing was what did it. Not the auction itself, which was legal and done every week somewhere in the territory. The laughing at her standing there holding everything she owned was what settled something in me. The opening bid was $20. Nobody moved. The auctioneer squeaked his voice up higher, made some comment about honest labor and a strong worker. Falk said something under his breath. I didn't hear it, but I saw the girl's jaw tighten the smallest amount, which told me she did. The man beside Falk shrugged and offered 25, the way you'd toss a coin at a beggar, not expecting anything in return. 40, somebody else. 55, the man beside Falk again, getting practical about it now. I had $200 in my front coat pocket. The mule I'd come for had sold an hour earlier, and I'd paid $60 for it and arranged to collect it on my way out of town. So I had $140 left, most of which was supposed to go toward seed and a fence repair I'd been putting off since spring. 60, Falk this time, finally deciding to join in. I said 75. Said it the same way I'd say pass the salt. There was a little silence. Falk turned around and looked at me. I was standing at the back, which meant he had to turn all the way around, which meant everybody else turned too. I was the only man in the yard who hadn't said a word up to that point. I had my hat on and my coat was dusty from the ride in, and I expect I looked like I usually look, which is like a man who'd rather be somewhere else. Falk said, "What's a man like you want with a cripple?" I didn't answer him. I looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer waited a few seconds to see if anyone would go higher. Nobody did. He had a manner that suggested he'd rather be done with this particular lot and get to something easier to sell. He banged his gavel and said sold and wrote my name down in his book, and I paid him the $75, and he gave me a copy of the contract, 2 pages of legal language that came down to: Clara Voss agreed to work in good faith for 3 years in domestic service, and I was now the employer owed that service. I walked over to the crate. She was still standing on it. The crowd had moved off. Falk gave me one more look over his shoulder, and then he left too, and it was just me and her and the auctioneer, who was putting away his papers and not paying attention. I said, "You can step down." She looked at me then. Green eyes, I noticed. Not soft green, the other kind. The kind that's been used to looking for trouble. She said, "What do you want me to call you?" I told her my name. Caleb Morrow. She repeated it once quietly, like she was filing it somewhere. I said, "I have a mule at the rail out front. It's a long ride." She said, "Where?" "My place, north of here 15 miles. "What kind of work?" I told her the truth, which was that my house needed someone to run it, that I had a cook who'd left in the spring to marry a man in Denver, that I had 2 hands who ate their meals in the bunkhouse but I took mine alone, and that there was a room at the back of the house that had been a storage room and still had some boxes in it, but it had a window and a door that locked from the inside, and she was welcome to it. She listened to all of this with those green eyes doing that thing where they weren't soft and weren't hard either, just watching. Then she said, "The contract says domestic service, not any other kind." "I know what the contract says," I told her. "I read it." She looked at me a little longer. Then she picked up her flour sack and stepped off the crate. We didn't talk much on the ride out. I had Hatch and I'd rented a second horse for her at the livery, a quiet roan mare named Bessie that the livery man said was good with uncertain riders. Clara Voss was not an uncertain rider. She sat the mare like she'd done it her whole life, moving with the horse the way you only learn from years of it, and I noticed her bad leg didn't seem to trouble her much in the saddle. The stirrup adjusted short on the left side, and her weight balanced easy. We crossed the dry creek at the 4-mile mark, and she said, without looking at me, "You didn't answer the man." I said, "Which man?" "Falk. He asked what you wanted with a cripple." I rode another 10 yards before I answered. Didn't figure he deserved one. She didn't say anything to that. The house came into view around 4 in the afternoon, the sun already dropping behind the ridge to the west and the whole place going gold in shadow. It was not an impressive house. 2 stories, but the second story was barely that, more of a loft with a window, where I slept. The main floor had a kitchen that took up half of it and a sitting room with a fireplace that smoked when the wind was wrong and a table I ate at alone most nights. The storage room at the back was 12 feet by 10, and when I pushed the door open the smell of old rope and saddle leather came out. I said, "I'll move the boxes tonight." She stood in the doorway and looked at it, looked at the window which faced east and would get morning light, looked at the plank floor. Then she said, "There's a crack under the door. Cold will come in from the north." I said I'd fix it. She said, "All right." I want to tell you what it was like, those first weeks, and I want to tell it right because people have a way of making it soft in the telling when it wasn't soft. It was practical. She cooked and kept the house, and I fixed the crack under her door and split extra wood so her room stayed warm, and she did not thank me for any of it, and I did not expect her to. We were 2 people working an arrangement. My hands 2 brothers named Ruiz, Tomas and Felix, who'd been with me 4 years, gave her a wide berth at first. Not rudeness, wariness. Men who work cattle learn to be careful around unknowns, and she was an unknown. Felix was the younger one, and he had a habit of whistling while he worked, which stopped entirely for about 2 weeks after she arrived, as if he was afraid the sound might disturb her. She didn't seem to notice. She had a way of moving through a space and making very little sound doing it. The bad leg accommodated so naturally you forgot about it. She carried 2 iron pots at once when she needed to. She repaired a chair that had been broken for a year, braced the leg with a piece of scrap wood and some wire, and set it back at the table without saying anything about it. I found it there one morning and sat down in it, and it held, and I thought about that for a while. About 3 weeks in, I came back from a long day fixing fence along the north pasture, and the whole house smelled like something I hadn't smelled since I was a boy. Onions and salt pork and some kind of herb I didn't know the name of. She'd gone out in the afternoon and found something growing along the creek. She told me later, not that night. She just put the bowl in front of me and sat across the table with her own bowl, and we ate. I said, "This is good." She said, "My mother taught me, in Pennsylvania." That was the first time she'd mentioned anything about where she'd come from. I didn't push it. I've found you get more from people by not pulling than by pulling, and she struck me as someone who knew very well the difference between the two. November came in hard. We had 3 days of sleet that coated everything and made the work brutal, and on the second night of it, Tomas came in from the bunkhouse to say that Felix had a fever. She was the one who went out there. I followed her, but she didn't ask me to. She had a cloth and a tin of something, some kind of salve, and she put the cloth on Felix's forehead and told Tomas to keep the fire going and to give him water every hour whether he asked for it or not. And she said it in the quiet voice she used when she'd already made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it. Felix's fever broke by morning. He was back on his feet in 2 days. After that, Tomas started tipping his hat to her when he came for meals. Not a courtesy hat tip, the kind you give to a woman because she's a woman. The other kind. The kind you give because you mean it. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice a thing that tells you something true. There was a man named Hector Gaines who had a spread to the east of mine, about 8 miles. We were not friends exactly, but we were neighbors, which in that country means something. He came by in late November to return a post-hole digger I'd lent him in September, and he stayed for coffee and sat at my table and looked around the kitchen the way men look when they're trying to understand something without asking directly. He said, "Heard you bought a girl in Callow Creek." I said I'd hired a domestic worker to replace my cook. He said, "Heard she's got a bad leg." I said that was right. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at me. Gaines was a straight man, not given to cruelty, and what he said next he said with genuine puzzlement, not meanness. He said, "What made you do it, Caleb? You could have found somebody whole." I looked at him for a moment. Outside I could hear the wind off the ridge and from somewhere in the back of the house, the sound of a pot being set down on a surface. I said, "She does the work." He nodded. He seemed to accept that, the way you accept an answer that's true even if it's not the whole truth. The whole truth was something I was only beginning to understand myself. The winter deepened and the days got short, and there was a particular quality to the evenings in that house that I hadn't known before. Light from the oil lamp on the table, the fire going, her at the other end of the room darning or reading. She'd found a box of books I'd shoved under a shelf and never looked at, novels and an almanac and a well-worn Bible, and she went through them steadily. I am not a man who does well with silence that feels empty. I'd lived alone for 6 years and I'd learned to manage it. The way you learn to manage a chronic pain, you accommodate it, build your days around it, try not to press on it. But there's a different kind of silence, the kind that has another person in it, where the quiet isn't empty but full in a way that's hard to name. She looked up from her book one evening and caught me looking at her. She said, "Something you want to say?" I said no. She went back to her book, but the corner of her mouth moved just slightly, not a smile exactly, the shape of one. In January, a man came to my door. He was maybe 45, well-dressed for out here, a wool coat that still had its buttons, a hat without a dent in it. He introduced himself as Mr. Seeley, said he was a factor for a family in Kansas City, and he had a proposition for me. I let him in. Clara brought coffee and set it on the table and moved to go, and Seeley watched her cross the room with that look men have when they're making calculations. He said that the girl from the Callow Creek auction. I said it was. He said his family was looking for a domestic worker, someone to run a large house in Kansas City. Said they'd pay well. Said they'd heard about the girl and wanted to make me an offer for the remainder of the contract. He named a figure that was roughly twice what I'd paid. I drank my coffee. He said, "It's good money, Mr. Morrow. She's got a limitation, but a house in the city, servants' quarters, a proper wage after the contract's done." I said no. He blinked. "I haven't finished." "You don't need to." He tried again, circling at it from a different angle, talking about what was best for the girl, the opportunities, a city versus a ranch in the middle of nowhere. I waited until he was done. Then I told him he was welcome to stay the night in the barn if the ride back to town was too far, and I stood up, which meant the conversation was over. After he left, he didn't stay the night. I sat at the table for a while. Clara came out of the kitchen and refilled my coffee and stood there. She said, "I heard." I said, "I figured." She said, "Why?" Not a question the way most people ask questions. More like she was testing the weight of a plank before she put her foot on it. I said, "Because it's not about the money." She stood there a moment longer. I didn't look up at her. I heard her set the coffee pot down on the iron plate and go back to the kitchen, and I didn't say anything else, and neither did she. But something shifted in the room that night. You can't always name the thing. You can only say it was different after than it was before. February. I'd been fighting a fence line on the east side that kept going down in the wind. 3 times in 3 weeks I'd ridden out and restaked it, and 3 times it had come down. On the 4th time I came back late, dark already, cold that had real teeth in it, and my hands were bad from the wire. Baling wire is unforgiving, and I'd cut both palms through my gloves. Nothing serious, but they'd bled and the cold had made it worse. I came in and she was at the table with her book, and she looked up and saw my hands. She didn't say anything dramatic. She just said, "Sit down." She brought a basin and some clean cloth and she cleaned both cuts in the lamplight, her head bent over the work, her hands steady. She had a way of being precise without being cold, efficient, but not mechanical. Like she'd learned that caring for people was a craft, not a feeling, and the craft had to come first because the feeling wasn't reliable. My right hand was worse. She wrapped it with the cloth and then held it for a moment, not examining it anymore, just holding it. Her thumb against my knuckle, warm. I looked at her. She looked up and our eyes met and held, and neither of us said anything. The lamp was throwing its light across half her face and her eyes were that green again, the kind that isn't soft, and yet right then I could only call it soft. She let go of my hand and stood up and took the basin away. I sat there and looked at my wrapped hand and didn't move for a long time. Spring came slowly, the way it does out there, not a turn but a loosening, like something that's been held tight gradually releasing. The creek came up. The pasture went from brown to pale yellow to something that was almost green. The days stretched out and the evenings came later, and there was more light in everything. I'd been thinking about the contract. 16 months had been what she owed when I bought it. That would run out in the summer, June, I calculated. I'd been thinking about it since February, and I'd been thinking about it the way you think about something that worries you, turning it over, checking it from different angles. In April I came in one afternoon, and she was in the kitchen, and I stood in the doorway and said I needed to talk to her. She dried her hands on her apron and turned around. I said, "The contract runs out in June." She nodded. She'd known that, of course she had. I said, "I want you to stay." She looked at me. I pushed on, because I'd learned that with her, you had to say the whole thing or it didn't count. I said, "Not the contract. I want to pay you wages, proper wages, the same as my hands. And I want you to have the room as yours, not as a condition of employment. And I stopped, started again. I want to know if you'd consider staying, of your own choosing, not because of any piece of paper." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a crow said something from the fence post and then was quiet too. She said, "What would I be staying as?" It was a fair question. I said, "Whatever you want to be. I'm not putting a name on it before you've had the chance to think." She looked at me for a long time. That way she had, where the looking wasn't passive, it was active, like she was checking for cracks. She said, "The man in January, the factor from Kansas City." I said, "Yes." She said, "You sent him away." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to know why, the real reason, not the short one." I looked at the floor. I looked back up at her. I said, "Because I couldn't think about this place without you in it. Because somewhere between October and now, the house stopped feeling like just a place I lived and started feeling like somewhere I wanted to be. And that hadn't happened to me in a long time, and I knew it was because of you." She stood very still. Then she said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "I've been in service since I was 14, 4 families. The Murphys in Albany, the Ferriers in Pittsburgh, a woman named Crane in St. Louis, and the Phelpses. 4 families, 9 years. I've been sent for and sold and contracted, and in all of it nobody once asked me what I wanted. Not one of the 4 families, not anyone at that auction." She paused. "You asked." I said I remembered. She said, "You asked what kind of work it would be. You told me the room had a lock on the inside. You fixed the crack under the door." She stopped. Her voice was even, not shaky, but very deliberate. "Tomas tips his hat to me." I said he should. She said, "You sent the factor away." I said I did. She looked at me one more time, that long, clear look, and then she said, "All right, Caleb." That was it, "All right, Caleb." Those 3 words, said in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window and the crow gone quiet on the fence post. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most freely given thing anyone had ever said to me. We married in June, which was the month the contract ran out, though the contract had stopped meaning anything to either of us long before then. Gaines stood up for me, and a woman named Mee Tilson, who ran the seamstress shop in Callow Creek and had befriended Clara over the winter, stood up for her. The ceremony was brief, at the preacher's house, because neither of us wanted a church full of people, and afterward we rode back to the ranch and she made the meal and we sat at the same table we'd sat at all winter, same lamp, same chairs, the chair she'd fixed still holding. She'd kept her name through the winter, Voss. After the wedding she added Morrow. Clara Voss Morrow. She wrote it on the inside cover of the almanac, the one she'd taken from my shelf, which I noticed and didn't comment on and was glad to see. There was a day in August, late summer, the heat starting to come off the land in the evenings, and the light going long and orange over the west ridge. I was on the porch doing nothing in particular, which was something I'd never been good at before and was slowly getting better at. She came and sat in the other chair. We didn't talk. The horses were in the lower pasture and you could hear them moving. A nighthawk went over, that particular sound it makes, and she tilted her head back to watch it go. After a while she put her hand over mine on the armrest, not looking at me, just put her hand there. I turned my hand over so my palm was up and her hand was in it, and I closed my fingers around it, and we sat there while the light went out of the sky. I thought about Denny Falk and his laugh. I thought about 9 years of service and 4 families, and no one asking what she wanted. I thought about the factor from Kansas City and his wool coat and his calculations. I thought about all of it and I let it go, the way you let smoke go when there's no point holding it. What I kept was this, the weight of her hand in mine, the smell of the grass coming up from the pasture, the sound of the horses, the sky going dark, slow and easy, the way it does out there when the day's been good. The crow on the fence post, come back for the evening. Her hand, my hand. The porch and the dark, and nowhere else I needed to be.